Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine. I am super excited to welcome Steve Phan, the Chief of Interpretation, Education, and Visitor Services at Camp Nelson National Monument. Steve, delighted for you to be here. Thank you.
A pleasure to see you, my friend. We were chatting with each other before we started recording. It's been about 3 years since we saw each other in person, then at Appomattox, and we were talking about you got to come out to Camp Nelson at some point, right? And it's been building up to this, which I look forward to chatting about. Great to see you, and look forward to chatting with you tonight.
Thanks. Yeah, it was wonderful when we saw each other last. You had this vision, I think, for bringing together activities and celebrate Camp Nelson and how important it is to Civil War history. And the fact that we have this amazing gathering coming up. I would love for you to talk a little bit about the backstory. How did this Camp Nelson 160th event come together? Tell me all about it.
Well, I know you reside in DMV for all of us that are in the know, right? And I lived in DC for about 5 years, worked for the Civil War Defenses of Washington for the Park Service. And when I told people I was going to Kentucky, they didn't believe me. They're like, no way, you're the city guy, you're the big food guy. And I'm like, no, I'm really going. And they're like, why? And I said, Camp Nelson. It's this really, really special site, this really dramatic and complex Civil War site that just recently became a National Park Service unit. And I had the opportunity to go out there to be the first chief of interp to help develop this new unit of the Park Service. So let's go and do this. And it's been building up to this, as we mentioned. And I think it had to be that way, right? When I saw you back, and I think in 2022, we just weren't there yet, right? As we were basically setting our foundation, and now we're building upon that. So that's why I'm here today. Look forward for you to come out actually next week. Yeah. And so Camp Nelson was started as a U.S. Army supply depot in 1863 by order of, believe it or not, General Ambrose Burnside, all the way from the Eastern Theater. And it becomes this one of the largest supply depot training centers established by the U.S. military during the Civil War. And its purpose, first and foremost, was to supply the East Tennessee campaign, which Burnside will lead from Camp Nelson, which is about 20 miles south of Lexington, in August of 1863. And it will successfully do that. And it will allow Burnside and the U.S. forces to liberate the region and stay in that area for the remainder of the Civil War. And then, the history of Camp Nelson, like the Civil War, like especially Civil War Kentucky, is very complex. It was almost shut down in 1864. I think for some of your viewers who are kind of learning more and more about the Civil War, if they hear the border states, the slave states that remain loyal to the Union, Missouri, Maryland, were close to where you're at, obviously Delaware, and Kentucky. These were loyal slave states where, slavery was legal and protected by state and federal law, but also loyal to the unions. And so that's a really complex, area to kind of navigate, which both the Army and civilians struggled with during the Civil War. And in 1864, the Army will start enlisting and training African-American men in Kentucky at 8 separate recruiting and training depots. And Camp Nelson will be the largest in the state. Over 10,000 men will join the U.S. military here. The majority of these men will be enslaved. They'll be joined by a lot of their family members as well. So Camp Nelson becomes a refugee site for freedom seekers as well. It's quite complex. And of the recruiting centers that are established across the country, Camp Nelson is the third largest in the country. Number 1 is New Orleans. Number 2 is Camp William Penn in Philadelphia. And I know you've shared a lot of incredible images of Camp William Penn. Camp Nelson's the largest, and it's the only surviving one of the top 3, if that makes sense. It's an incredible site now. It was became a national. I'm sorry, excuse me. It was a county park for about 20 years. It was called Camp Nelson Heritage Park from 1998 to 2018. In October of that year, it's declared the 418th unit of the National Park Service. And it was only really, though, Ron, until up to 2021, when there was a permanent Park Service presence on the grounds. Superintendent Ernie Price is the very first superintendent for you Civil War buffs. He worked at Appomattox for years and years. Yeah. I came from DC, and we are the very first permanent Park Service staff here. So
So what was Camp Nelson prior to 1998? Was it recognized in any way from the
yeah,
war
that's a
period
great
up until
question.
that time?
Well, directly south of us is Camp Nelson National Cemetery, actually, which is managed by the Department of Veteran Affairs. During the Civil War, it was a part of Camp Nelson, the military base.
Mhm.
There was a cemetery there for soldiers and civilians that died at Camp Nelson, including civilians that were contracted to work by the Army. So Camp Nelson, at its height, was over 4,000 acres, featured over 300 wooden structures, and I know there's a lot of Civil War and military image buffs on here. Clearly, we have over 40 historic images of Camp Nelson, right? Of all
Wow.
the structures, buildings that supported military operations. You can imagine the military or the War Department spent a lot of money here, so they wanted to document what was here, and they used photography to do that.
And so for all of our Civil War photography friends and collectors, there's a studio, right? On the
Apparently,
yeah.
up to 3 photography studios.
Wow.
And I think for the photography gurus that are listening and follow the work that you do, the CJ Young was this gentleman from Lexington,
Mhm.
was in his early 20s and comes down to Camp Nelson and opens up a photography and stencil studio.
Huh.
So he was a young entrepreneur, and there's a really great 1864 map of Camp Nelson that shows a lot of the wooden buildings that were related to the military, and then some civilian structures as well, including the Sutler area. And the county archaeologist, Dr. Steve McBride, the leading expert on Camp Nelson, who will be presenting after you on the 26th of July,
Mm.
he started excavating the Sutler shop, found a lot of things related to what the Sutler sold, from
Mhm.
oysters to sardine cans. I mean, from France, right? I mean, that's why
Wow. Wow.
archaeology is so cool. And then uncovered, because it was not on the map, the photography studio
Oh,
led
wow.
by CJ Young. So he'll be presenting on that. We've got a lot of artifacts that have been recovered from the photography studio that we'll be sharing as well. But just to quickly answer your question, people in this area, they know of Camp Nelson as the National Cemetery, right?
Mm, mm,
And as I mentioned, there was just a regular cemetery there that became the National Cemetery starting in 1866.
mm.
But up until 1998, it was mostly farmland, right? And then it was uh, preserved and protected by the county, and then it expanded, and they developed like which you'll see next week, Ron, a visitor center, a museum, a
Mm,
trail system. I mean, they put in 20 plus years of work here to make this a
mm.
national park site, and we're just fortunate to build upon what they did. And you're going to see Dr. McBride talk about the archaeology at Camp Nelson. It's absolutely spectacular. For people that have light colored hair, he found dye bottles at the photography studio that CJ Young was
Wow.
seeing from these portraits. Yeah. So people, as with lighter hair, might blur in their image. It might be hard to see. So
Yeah,
they
yeah,
dyed their hair. Yeah,
yes, and the photographer wanted to get the best picture possible, to make the customer happy, right? So whatever
exactly.
it takes.
And I think archaeologists would tell you, I know they're really looking at soils. For us, kind of amateur archaeologists who are interested in like finding artifacts,
Mm,
he found brass stencils that CJ Young did.
wow.
He personalized these for a lot of the soldiers. The soldiers would have their initials, right, and their regiments on there.
Mm,
And either he made a mistake or he was testing them. He would crumple them up and just throw them on the ground. So
yeah.
thankfully for CJ Young and for us, or thankfully for us, CJ Young deposited a lot of his trash on the ground, which was excavated 100 plus years later. So it's really
I
exciting.
I wanna think that he did that on purpose so we could
Exactly.
find it
No, I
later
always
on
say
and
this is going to
know.
be discovered by an archaeologist, and this is going to lead to a really important historic site, in the 20th century. So we're really fortunate, because I know
Yeah.
you talk a lot about like individual portraits, but
Yes.
the fact that we've got these dramatic landscape and mostly wooden structures, right? But also
Yeah.
fortifications and corrals and things like that. We're able to pinpoint where all these buildings were at, right? That
Yeah.
helps us interpret the site, as you know. It helps us talk about the people that were here. I think if you compare it, Ron, to like a battlefield, right? During the Civil War, where armies come and go, a lot of the images we see are after the battle, right? Obviously, they're not snapping
Right.
photos during the battle.
Right.
They called it Camp Nelson, but it was a semi-permanent military base for 3 years, right? As I said,
Mhm.
over
Mhm.
4,000 acres, thousands of people at times. it was the second largest city in Kentucky after Louisville,
Right.
and that's why we have 40 plus historic images of buildings, and you see a lot of soldiers, civilians, refugees, right?
Mm.
It's all here, and you're going to see that next week, which is incredibly exciting because it's hard to imagine this landscape because it becomes agricultural again after the Civil War, right? Life goes on.
Right.
But I think one of our goals, as we mentioned, as I talked to you a few years ago, we're trying to restore the historic landscape of Camp Nelson, and the
Yes.
photography is instrumental in us doing that.
Yeah, because it really is your visual blueprint for what it looked like and get a sense of what the structures were all about, what the individuals who were around there, what they were doing, how they were using the site. All of that has just provides a wealth of information for you all.
Absolutely. Very
Now,
exciting. And the Friday before, the 26th,
mhm,
the big anniversary date,
yeah,
we're doing a History at Sunset, a Camp Nelson then and now photography tour. And we're going down into what we call the heart of Camp Nelson, where the warehouse district was at. This is where all the military supply structures were at. The bakery was at.
mm,
And we have this area was not managed by the county, but it's now managed by the National Park Service. And so we have full access to it. And this is, as I mentioned, the heart of Camp Nelson. This is the reason why it became this massive base, was because of the supply aspect, right?
mm.
The refugee and African American experience will evolve it dramatically in 1864 and 1865. So we're going down there, and you'll appreciate this. We've enlarged the photos. We've mounted them on polymetal. They're like 6 pounds
Nice.
each, and we're taking them out to the field,
Oh,
right?
nice.
And we'll have period maps with us, and Dr. McBride is going to show us where everything was at. He's going to pinpoint things on the landscape, right? A truly a then and now moment. And I know a lot of your followers love those sessions because you take so much from it, right?
Yes. Well, I also one of the things that I really admire about what you're doing and the staff and everyone that has uh, whose who built whose shoulders you're standing upon. What you're doing is, at least from where I sit, you're shining a light on an aspect of the war, the supply hub, the
Yes, sir.
place where individuals were recruited, where they were trained, where they gathered, where they congregated. That's as much a part of the war as any part of the war.
Well said.
And for you all to be able to bring that together and provide interpretation, I think makes it even all the more unique because at the end, and from the work that I do, I like to tell human stories, the
Right.
stories behind the portraits. All of these men, they spent time at Camp Nelson and Camp William Penn and other camps across the states. And this is where they met with their friends. They talked about what happened, what might happen. They wrote letters to home. And it's where they sort of formed some of those bonds. And of course, I'm
Absolutely.
sure it was always not that pretty. There were
Right.
wounded men
Absolutely.
and sick men and folks who were passing from various illnesses or battle wounds or things like that. So, it's not always a happy story, but it's centered around places, I think, like Camp Nelson.
Well, I couldn't have said it better, on. You know what, I describe Camp Nelson as the crossroads, right? This is where people come together, right? It's
Yeah.
the intersection of military and civilian,
Yes.
slavery and emancipation, right?
Uh,
Loyalty and unionism and conditional unionism and secession. You see it all here on this landscape, and it's quite dramatic. I mean, as I mentioned, we have not only refugees here from enslavement, which is obviously a critical story. I know
yeah.
Camp Nelson used, the national significance you see is the end of slavery in many ways, with over 10,000 men joining, their families, and other freedom seekers come here as well. They're expelled multiple times in 1864, and it's quite horrific, especially in November of 1861 when over 400 are expelled. But that actually leads to positive change,
Mhm.
good from evil, as the chief quartermaster would call this. It
Yeah.
leads to the establishment of the home for called refugees at Camp
Mm.
Nelson,
Wow.
including the March 3rd Order, 1865, which emancipates the wives and children of Black soldiers.
Wow.
So
Wow. How
into
powerful.
June of 1865, right, Lee surrendered,
Mhm.
and uh, the other Confederate forces in the field are going to capitulate relatively soon, right? Lincoln has already
Right.
been assassinated.
Yes.
The Army is still enlisting men at Camp Nelson because it frees their families, right?
Mm,
That's
mm, mm.
really, really powerful.
Yeah.
And a year before, there are East Tennessee refugees that make their way to Camp Nelson.
Mm,
They join one of 7 white regiments organized here.
mm.
And when Burnside leads this campaign from Camp Nelson into East Tennessee, quite prophetic, of course,
Mm,
and symbolic, the vanguard of his army were East Tennessee soldiers
mm, mm, mm.
coming home to like liberate their
Wow.
families, right? And
Wow. How powerful is that?
the accounts from the soldiers marching home,
Yeah.
uh, it's you can just kind of feel it, right? From
Yeah.
the
I'm getting goosebumps right now
yeah,
just hearing
right.
you talk
And
about it. Yeah.
one of the funniest stories is, the roads in Knoxville and East Tennessee were lined with American flags, and one soldier remarks, "Where did they hide all these flags at? Because they just came out of nowhere, right?" And so, 160 years later is the relevance part, right? And so, getting back to like what kind of led up to this and having you come out as the keynote, Ron, is, I wanted to take advantage of the 160th of Camp Nelson, especially as a new unit of the Park Service.
Yeah.
So in 2023, our big focus was the establishment of Camp Nelson in April. And then we had this huge anniversary program over 3 days to mark the East Tennessee or Knoxville campaign, which
Mm,
was, the biggest event we've ever done at Camp Nelson. And it was very successful, worked with a lot of great living history groups and historians.
mhm.
And then for 2024, last year, we were really focused on where everything changes at Camp Nelson, right? With Black enlistment starting in June of 1864, and the arrival of African American refugees, the expulsion of African American refugees. And this year, we're focused on the end of the Civil War into 1865, right? So,
Mhm.
and
Mm.
as you know, there are Camp Nelson soldiers in Richmond, in
Yeah.
Petersburg, and one makes it out to Appomattox,
Yeah.
and a couple regiments make it all the way out to Texas. And we know about the 5th and 6th U.S. Colored Cav, right?
Mm,
These men are from Kentucky and they go everywhere, right? And so
mm,
it's really
mm.
cool to show, or I think really powerful to show, um, just what these men experienced over the course of even 1 year, right?
Right.
And as I mentioned, in the summer of 1865, Camp Nelson is still active, right?
Mm, mm.
And on July 4th, African American soldiers and refugees organized their very first Independence Day at Camp Nelson, which
Wow.
features like music and food and military parades and things like that, right? And
Wow.
so it's quite this powerful experience. One observer from England, he was with his Abolition Society, and he was blown away by. Uh, and he arrived at Camp Nelson in late June, and he was at the home for called refugees, and the soldiers and their families were organizing this Independence Day event that was
Mm,
coming up in a week.
mm.
And you can imagine, coming out of slavery, they did not have a lot of resources, but people are providing, what little money they had to celebrate Independence Day, right?
Yes.
In July of 1865.
And the
Uh,
fact that they're actually going to that to pool whatever resources they have to recognize the day in context of everything else that you've described,
right,
seeking their freedom,
right,
finding that freedom at Camp Nelson, and then being able to move to different parts of the country. Some of those Black men in blue who are now off in Virginia fighting.
right.
To be able to have that kind of a reach and then bring it back is just so powerful. And I love the idea that the 160th, you're commemorating it, you're really bringing together all this rich history from that time period and bringing it into the 160th. I know you have an entire schedule planned for July 26th, and all of that is available on Facebook, right? We've got the event set up, and I'm sure there's other places folks
Yeah,
can
Ron,
get
it's
this
yeah,
information.
it's on our website, and we're on, we promote it, as you said, on Facebook, right? And it's, as I've said, it's really started to come together, right? Obviously, you're the keynote. Dr. McBride will be talking about the photography of Camp Nelson, including the photography studio. We've got artifacts from the archaeological survey that we're
Mhm.
pulling that will be featured in a temporary exhibits.
Wow.
So you might see some of those dye bottles that soldiers use to
Yeah.
color their hair, right?
I may,
Uh,
I may have to try some myself.
right, exactly. I'm thinking of Ron Popeil's
Yes.
spray back in the 90s. Remember that? Uh,
Yes. It didn't,
which is
it didn't work for me then. It was not going to work
okay,
now.
okay. Um, but this is, I think a lot of people know Victorian Photography Studio in Gettysburg.
Yes.
My friend, the well-regarded Civil War photographer Dave Wilson will be at Camp Nelson to talk about the process of Civil War photography.
Nice.
And also, he'll be shooting plates as well. And so, visitors that come out to the park will have an opportunity to take photos as well. So, just like C.J.
Wow.
Young back in the
Yeah.
1860s, right? And on the back of the CDVs, right, it said
Yeah.
Camp Nelson, Kentucky, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's when I think Dr. McBride discovered there were 2 to maybe even 3 photography studios there.
Mm,
So
mm.
I think we all appreciate young entrepreneurs, right? I think we all do it on. You see people do it online now, but hey, this
Sure.
young guy in his early 20s made the trip down to Camp Nelson and was selling photos and stencils. I think that's pretty cool.
I think that's another aspect of, you were talking about the civilian population. Here you
Yes,
have an entrepreneur who is, I know there are business reasons that he has gone to Camp Nelson, but also there's an audience there of individuals who want to have their photographs taken to
absolutely,
remember this moment and to be
absolutely.
able to share it with family and friends. And so both sides are winning in that kind of a
I think
situation.
so too, and I wonder, Ron, as people uncover more things, because I asked you obviously before this. I remember we were talking about you coming out, and
Yeah.
you're like, I can make this a collection trip, right, and go see
Yes.
some image, photography collections. I'm like, hey, that's a great way to organize a trip.
Yeah.
And I wonder, right, because if you look at a lot of the images of the buildings at Camp Nelson, you see soldiers, but you mostly see civilian employees contracted by the Army, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
at the National Cemetery, I tell visitors it's one of the most unique national cemeteries in the country. It's still open for burials, by the way.
Mm.
There's a large number of Civil War soldiers buried there. 837 U.S. colored troops, by the way. That's a huge concentration. The
Wow.
most from Camp Nelson, obviously. Some other U.S. soldiers that fought at Perryville and some of the big battles in the state too. But
Mm.
if you look closely in the historic section, you'll see headstones that say employee on them,
Oh, wow.
which is pretty
Wow.
unique, right? One even says
Wow.
colored employee. And
Huh.
I tell visitors, those are not like spouses of military service personnel. Those are civilians that died at Camp Nelson. That's why they were allowed to be buried there, because it was not a national cemetery yet. And everyone visited the Sutler, and some of these businesses that offered goods and wares for soldiers and civilians. I imagine there were civilian employees that took their photo at the CJ Young studio as well, right? And
Yeah.
maybe one day we'll come across those. That would be pretty cool.
Well, I promise you, I'm going to do my very best to try and help along
Yes,
that
indeed.
mission to be able to uncover some of those images. As you know, one of the most exciting aspects of Civil War photography, particularly the portrait photography, there's so much out there that is yet to be found because a lot of this was never really intended for public display. They were
Right.
for personal albums and more personal consumption. And so we're living in a fantastic time right now because so much is coming out, and because we're in the digital age, there's more opportunity to
Right.
spread the word and get everyone involved. So I'm excited to see what we can find for to make more connections photographically and visually for Camp Nelson. So
Can't wait.
before we close the segment,
Yeah.
I do want to ask you, and I have to get back to the beginning. I do remember you as Steve, the guy who did the wonderful presentation about the defenses of
Right.
Washington,
Right.
and you were just so the energy and the passion was there. I'm feeling that same energy and passion now from you with Camp Nelson. Tell me, in that move to Camp Nelson and all that you've learned since then, what's the biggest surprise for you? What really has maybe something has changed you as a result, or
Yeah.
maybe just sort of an oh wow moment. I don't know.
That's a really great question, Ron. And I think working at Civil War battlefield sites, right, including the defenses of Washington, like Fort Stevens, and I was an intern at Gettysburg and Richmond National Battlefield, Park Stones River National Battlefield.
Yeah.
You meet a lot of descendants, right, and it's
Yeah.
one of the most powerful experiences, personal experiences you get. That descendants are basically walking in the footsteps of their ancestors, especially on battlefields. That's pretty special, and I've met a lot of descendants of U.S. colored troops at Camp Nelson, and including not just let me just say Camp Nelson soldiers, African American soldiers, people that even came from East Tennessee. There was a soldier in his early teens. I'm sorry, early 20s. Made it to Camp Nelson from East Tennessee, deserted, came back, right, and his family came and shared his papers with us, and we were able to create a bio of that, right?
Wow.
I think for me, what's been some of the most powerful experiences that I've learned so much is the power of place, and the living legacy of the African American experience has been so powerful for me in Kentucky. And I meet descendants all the time. They're actively involved in the development of the park. They have been for years, right? As you said, we're just on their shoulders, right? And so we're just building upon the work of so many that came before us. And we were talking about one of our mutual friends, David Brown.
Yes. Yeah.
The descendant of
Sam
Trueheart,
Trueheart.
right? Our guy Sam Trueheart, the 5th U.S. Colored Cav. And David had been to Camp Nelson before I met him. And then we started communicating, and I know you've been communicating with him for years. And when I got to Camp Nelson, I kept on seeing this image of Samuel Trueheart. I'm like, who is this soldier, right? I don't know much about the soldier. Started researching him. By the way, the National Park Service regional office in our region, the Southeast region, is Atlanta. And I've been down to Atlanta, and I see Sam Trueheart's image. I'm like, oh my gosh! I'm like, it's such a powerful image, right? And then I think some people that are listening now, or see this later on, they might have seen the Secrets of the Dead episode about the Civil War's Lost Massacre, which focuses on the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry, features Samuel Trueheart, and you'll see David Brown in this episode. And I'll never forget the day he actually brings Sam's tintype to the park, right?
Wow.
That was incredible. And they had all these other family heirlooms, from his service record, from the family photo with his wife and children taken after the Civil War. And one of my favorite things is I blew up that image, and David and I took the photo of us holding Sam in front of the visitor center, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it was just really special to be with a descendant that had put so much work into, promoting and interpreting the history of the 5th U.S. Colored Cav, his family history, right? And then, as we shared before we started recording, like thousands of other Kentuckians, Sam Trueheart goes out to Kansas after the Civil War. He's an exoduster, right? Looking for a better life for him and his family post emancipation, in the midst of, the rise of Jim Crow and things like that. And, he sets up, helps establish a new homestead. And then when David told me that they still own the 60-acre plot in Nicodemus, I was like, oh, he's like, that's to honor Sam. I'm like, that was incredibly powerful. So,
well, I think it gets to the, living legacy. Your word choice really, that's going to stay with me.
Yeah.
Because when I think about collectively,
yeah,
what we do, you're on the front lines of Camp Nelson, interpreting the work that I'm doing around Civil War photography.
Right.
What this is, to what end are we doing this? We're part of that living legacy, trying to inform, trying to educate, trying to raise awareness. And when I hear you talk about meeting families and making that connection of people who are around today, alive today, and the future generations of Americans who are going to have that experience too. To me, it's sort of, it's that thread that connects us all in the fabric of the country. And it's wonderful that we have, I feel fortunate to have that opportunity.
I do as well. And I'll share one final thing to kind of cap this session. I simply call us the caretakers, right?
Yeah.
It's really descendants and the people that are deeply connected to the site that are the ones telling the stories, right? And I mentioned in 1865, the War Department established the home for colored refugees at Camp Nelson, which would grow and up to over 3,000 to 4,000 refugees by the summer of 1865. After the Civil War, there's a small post-war community that's developed there from former soldiers and refugees. There are still descendants living there of U.S. colored troops from Camp Nelson. One of them was born there, was a decorated Vietnam War vet, served in the Navy. His father served. His grandfather served. We know the history of his ancestors that served in the U.S. colored troops at Camp Nelson. And you know what he describes Camp Nelson as? Hallowed ground.
Oh, nice.
And he also said, I am Camp Nelson. So when a descendant that still lives in the community tells you that, it's been in that community for 160 years.
Wow.
That's power of place. That's the living legacy, right? That's it for me.
And I can't think of a better way to end this conversation. It's wonderful. Steve, thank you so much for
It's a privilege and a pleasure, my friend. It's good to see you.
Really,
and I'll see you in
great.
Kentucky.
I'll see you soon. All right. Take care.